Welcome to the Affirming Village Podcast, where we center neurodivergent voices, affirm diverse ways of being, and empower families, educators, and advocates with knowledge that truly honors the whole learner. We're your co-hosts, Dr. Destiny Huff, a late diagnosed autistic ADHD mental health therapist and non-attorney special education advocate, and Lisa Baskin Wright, an ADHD and dyslexic educator and IEP coach. Together, we dig into conversations about neuroaffirming practices, special education, and disability rights. Please remember, nothing shared on this podcast is medical or legal advice, and the views shared here by the host and the guests are their personal opinions. This space is for educational purposes only, to help you feel informed, empowered, and never alone in the village. Guys, welcome back to the Affirming Village Podcast. Today we're talking about when bias shows up at the table. Let's be honest, racism, ableism, and classism are alive and well in special education.
Yes, they don't always show up as blatant comments. Sometimes it's who is believed in the room, whose concerns are prioritized, and whose child gets resources without a fight.
As a Black autistic parent, I've had my concerns dismissed until a white professional repeated them, and that's bias in action.
And as a white mom in advocacy spaces, I've seen how my privilege impacts the outcomes for my child and how that's not the case for every family.
So today we'll unpack some real life examples, anonymous of course, of how bias plays out in IEP decisions and how to name it without losing your seat at the table.
Because you can't dismantle what you won't name.
I really love that part of the script because it's so valid and accurate. Like if you're not willing to call it out, to face it, to look at it, to listen, to learn, then you can't call it out because in your mind it doesn't exist.
That's correct. That is correct. No, and one of the pieces that wasn't in the script that I'm going to add ad lib here is not only have I experienced some level of privilege advocating for my own child, but I witness it as an advocate, right? I will step into situations as like a middle-aged white woman, educated white woman with some experience with an older child who's sort of been on the journey into spaces with Black and Brown families that are not being listened to. And somehow, miraculously, me being in the room changes the conversation. And it's really both exceedingly frustrating to see it so clearly, and at the same time also celebrating that we've moved the needle.
Right.
But it's tainted because we've moved the needle only because I've entered the space. And so it doesn't fully repair the trust. Like you got a bad taste in your mouth, even though they're finally doing right. And so it's like, you're going to have to prove over time through action and not just words in this meeting and not just what you're putting on this piece of paper. It's going to take us a hot minute before we actually believe that you're willing to do this work and really just willing to see this learner as the full human being that they are. It can't just be because the old white lady showed up and you decided to pull your stuff together. It's like disgusting.
Yeah. I mean, no, because I mean, what you're saying is just so valid because a lot of times as advocates, like, we are not attorneys, but we do know the law. And so we step in there with that professional aspect, right? But what you're really speaking to is when you specifically, as a white woman, step into that room and you are often repeating situations, concerns that your Black and Brown clients have already told you. And because you're a white woman, there's this perception that, oh, okay, this is a valid thing, this is a valid concern. And I will see like the opposite of that, where as soon as I flash on the screen, because my clients are white, Black, brown, right?
Sure.
And so I can flash on the screen, and as soon as I come on virtually, because I do all my meetings virtually, they are surprised that the doctor of the advocate is a Black woman. And so
Sure.
you can visibly see it when I come on the screen if they haven't already done their research, because you can very easily go to my website. Um, but it's just
True,
very
true statement.
interesting. And there's even been times on my side of it where the parent has defaulted to me, and this will be a white parent who will default to me,
Sure.
and they will kind of almost be dismissive of like, well, what do you all think? And the parents will turn around and say exactly what Dr. Huff said is how we view it, so that's how we want you to write it down.
Right. Right. No, I mean, I think that, and you and I have talked about this, both in community and just in voice notes and offline, that we both experience to a degree that difference when we enter the room. We have clients um, from all backgrounds that will say, "Gosh, this is the best meeting we've ever had." And so some of that is just having an advocate in the room, but it
Right.
is palpably different when
Mm-hmm.
I have a Black or brown family that has been saying all the things that I come into the space and say, and now all of a sudden it's like listened to differently, validated differently. And that is quite gross. I did have an experience, this was earlier on, where I was working with a single Black mom, and they just were so dismissive of her. It was just disgusting. And
Mm-hmm.
everything was oriented to me. And I was like, no, 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 no. I'm not mom. I'm not expert on learner.
Mm-hmm.
She is. So I just kept redirecting it back to her. And I think it was such a gross experience for her. And
Mm-hmm.
it was so enraging for her that she ultimately sought legal counsel because we
Right.
really weren't successful in moving the needle. And so not only were we not successful in moving the needle, she was being completely dismissed as the expert on her child. And
Mm-hmm.
it was really disgusting.
Yeah, and I mean, I know that, and now, we're 3 episodes in. So people, we go back to saying like we always weave our stories throughout. And again, my son was a Black child in a predominantly white school,
Right.
predominantly white staff. And, I will just never forget the special educator saying, I've been doing this for 13 years or whatever, and I've never seen a child um essentially behave in the way that yours has, and you really need to consider oppositional defiant disorder. And that for me was absolutely a trigger, because I was like, first of all, I'm the only mental health professional in this room. I'm the
Right.
only mental health professional that, only person in this room that's been trained on the DSM. And so for me, which is a diagnostic statistical manual, and that is what is used to privately diagnose individuals. And I was like, so that's out of your wheelhouse, that's out of your depth. And
Right.
I literally said, you know, and if y'all bring that up one more time, it's going to be a problem. And I was saying it essentially
Right.
like, I will come across this table because, like, you are literally only saying that because you have this outdated, stereotyped, biased view of autism. And
Correct.
my son doesn't fit that view and perception for you. And so you're trying to label him in that way. And
Correct.
so that was very frustrating for me. And as a parent, really kind of opened my eyes to what I could potentially face over the next 12 years of his academic career.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And interestingly, obviously, we're a white family. My daughter is white. But when we went in for her initial um, like diagnostic screening with a very well-known um, institution, the practitioner walked in and took one look at her and said, "Oh, she's making eye contact. There's no way she's autistic, but I guess I'll do the assessment." And I thought, well, don't hurt yourself. And my daughter was 2.5 at the time, and she did have spoken language, but she was so stressed, and I didn't understand how stress impacts access to spoken language at that time, right? Like she was so young and I was so early on in my learning journey that I didn't fully understand situational mutism, sometimes referred to as selective mutism. I didn't understand any of those things. But she was unable to speak for the first 2.5 hours of the assessment. And then slowly some of the language came, and then the shutdown happened again. And when the shutdown happened, we're now 4 hours into this awful assessment, and she was 2.5 years old. And so she curled in a ball, and like I picked her up and put her in my lap, and she had her blanket over her head, and I was about to crawl under there with her. But the provider basically said to me, "You're the problem. You coddle her too much. And this kid is on the road to oppositional defiance disorder. And when she's 13, she's going to call you a bitch." And the only thing I could think at the time was, aren't you supposed to call your mother a bitch when you're 13? And then I completely dissociated. I honestly have no idea if we were in that office for 5 more minutes or another 45 minutes. I kind of
Right.
came to when I heard Aaron, my husband, say, "Well, thank you so much for your time," and like sort of felt him get up. And then I was like, "Oh, we're leaving." So I do think that when a child falls outside of that white male stereotypical presentation of autism, we start bumping into people's bias. And so there's no way that my daughter could possibly be autistic. She was just apparently, had a defiance disorder. And I was like, well, her mother might. Obviously, I'm kidding. I'm being coy. But I think that bias shows up in multiple ways, obviously different settings, but even in that, like her pediatrician was not a prick. And I went to him and he was like, "You have to complain." And I was like, "I don't have the bandwidth to complain." And he was like, "You have to." And so I did, and I was completely dismissed. Completely dismissed. And she did not get an autism diagnosis for another 6 years.
And I mean, you speak to so many things though about, how bias shows up can often be inherently rooted in what we know, right?
Yeah.
In what we've been taught. And
Right.
that's what
What we think we know.
right. And that's what they always say, like, children are not born racist, right? Because they're
Exactly.
like, they learn that. They can use language and not even know what it means. And so when we start talking about how bias shows up at the table, in my opinion, it's because a lot of times people listen to respond. They don't
Correct.
listen to learn. And so they come in the room with their perception already of this learner. Whether, and I always want to give things where it's due because as adults we get frustrated, we get dysregulated with our children. And so I can't imagine, being in a classroom with 26 kids, 20 kids, 19 kids, 15 kids, whatever, and
36.
having to regulate. Right, Lisa can because she was an educator. And so it's a different view and concept, but what gets left out a lot is that they are children. And
Right.
so when you step into that room, the goal is to support. And a lot of times I think what gets confused is that schools can perpetuate this view that you either have to support the educator and the other learners in the room or the learner on the IEP and the
Right.
504, the disabled learner. And that's not true. When you support the disabled learner, you're also supporting the staff and the other learners in the room.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, this is a side story, but I got really sick towards the end of the year when I was teaching, and Aaron had to take all my stuff to school. And, everybody was like banging on the tables and doing whatever they were doing. And he came home like twitching and completely dysregulated. And he was like, "How do you tolerate all of that?" And I was like, "What are you talking about?" Like, I had never seen it. right? It just shows like our two totally different neurodivergent brains processing,
Mm-hmm.
you know, that movement and noise and whatever dynamics of a classroom.
Mm-hmm.
And so some of it is, Meg Thompson talks a lot about this, that sort of that first step in supporting quote unquote behavior in a classroom is knowing yourself and your own temperament and your own needs and meeting your own needs first. And I do think that that piece um, is missing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we do, as educators, become dysregulated, and then we think that we're right and we think that we know. And when we're in that space, we can't be curious because we're no longer really in our thinking and our learning brain. We're just
Mm-hmm.
reacting. But it's, I worked as a mentor for new teachers for a long time. And what I loved about the program was that it was incredibly inquiry based. So, what we were trying to do was help teachers build a really reflective practice
Mm-hmm.
where they were, seeing themselves as both a teacher and like a learner and a
Mm-hmm.
decision maker under the umbrella of teacher, right? Because that's what teachers do. We are constantly making decisions. But if we're missing that reflective piece and sort of looking back at those decisions, we're going to be missing the mark. And I
Mm-hmm.
do think that, I had a teacher that I loved and she was wonderful and she was really struggling with a neurodivergent, unidentified, neurodivergent Black female student in her elementary school class.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and she was taking this learner's dysregulation personally.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of the work I had to do with her was to name the difference in their temperament,
Mm-hmm.
but also very specifically name the dynamic of white female teacher, Black female learner not getting the support that she needed.
Mm-hmm.
And that in every decision the white female teacher was making, she had to be cognizant of that dynamic because the decisions that she was going to make were going to have a very direct impact on that young person, and that she had to humanize her and not get stuck in her own, feeling, her own feelings like I'm being disrespected or I'm whatever it was.
Mm-hmm.
No, this is a young person whose needs are not being met, and you have to recognize that dynamic. And they ultimately ended up really pivoting and really building a solid relationship with this young person that I really think was pivotal in different ways for both of them.
Mm-hmm.
But part of my role as her mentor was to name the bias that was playing out in the classroom, like period, full stop.
Absolutely. And what you're talking about is very difficult for a lot of people to do. Um, because I always say, like, I was having a conversation with my sister the other day, and we were talking about seeing something in a store with a parent and a child. And I was telling her, I said, a struggle for a lot of parents when there is maybe an issue or concern is that they then have to look at their role as a parent, right? And what they're doing. And a lot of
100%.
times when we step into the school setting and at the IEP table, there is a lot of blame placed, right? And a lot of times it's the parents saying what the school's not doing and the school saying what they feel the parents not doing,
Right.
but nobody's really looking at, how does that really get us to the learner and their needs and their support and making that connection. We often point that out and then we're like, okay, so that's your fault. And it's like, okay, next thing. And it's
Right,
like,
doesn't serve a good purpose. It's a great question to ask, is how is this moving us towards our supposedly mutual goal
right.
of supporting this young person? And so then
Absolutely.
it falls on, it falls really flat
Mm-hmm.
when, you know, anybody sitting at that table doesn't feel like they're genuinely being listened to. And the
Mm-hmm.
person they feel they're not being listened to by is like, we really care about the learner. And it's like, do you? Right. And I actually think that there is care, but
Mm-hmm.
it shows up in ways that can feel really inauthentic, especially when bias and ego are coming into that process.
Ugh,
It's a
ego.
terrible combination.
It is, and that's one of the biggest things I always say is that like the ego cannot be in the room. The ego has to be removed. And I think that a lot of times when you are questioning, right, just asking questions, people can take that personally and that you're saying this is what I'm not doing. And it's like, it's not that I'm saying that you're not doing something. I'm genuinely trying to understand how you're doing something. Now, I say that as a neurodivergent person, and I'm very aware that societally, there are societal norms where people are being messy and people are being petty, and they're doing that to say what you're not doing. But me being an autistic and ADHD person, when I say, walk me through one of the biggest safety issues in your classroom with this learner. Walk me through what is happening before, during, and after. Walk me through how you're responding. Walk me through. This is not me doing an interrogation, right? This is not me trying
Right.
to get you in trouble. This is me legitimately trying to see where are the chinks in the armor? Where can we make adjustments to support you and this learner so everyone feels safe, everyone feels comfortable? But because of how society can be, it's automatically perceived as there's this negative thing. And so then bias enters that way, in that one, there's an advocate in the room. So,
Sure.
like the second an advocate is mentioned, it's immediately like, oh my gosh, they're coming to tear us apart, do this, da 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 da. No,
Right.
some aren't. I always say there are some great and some not so great in every single category role, and that is one of them. So every advocate's not a great advocate, um,
Absolutely.
but that bias comes in. I will see times where bias comes in because the district personnel. So pretty much any meeting I'm in, it's going to be the special education director and it's at the meeting, and I get that special privilege being an advocate. And
This is true. It's a true story.
right. And so when that happens, they kind of come in almost like anything that you have to say, I like can challenge, right? So there's that bias and perception too, that like I'm coming in to be this negative person.
Sure.
And then there's this bias that the parent has brought in an advocate, right?
Right.
Because the school is not doing their job. When really a lot of times I get brought in because parents don't understand the IEP and
Absolutely.
don't understand how to use the language that the posts, the social media posts and things are giving them to advocate for their child. And they're like, you said it best, so can you explain this? But that's a few examples of where I see bias come in, is just this immediate negative perception instead of trying to facilitate this cohesiveness. And sometimes bringing in an advocate, because it does bring in a district personnel, you do get the person that can make the decision. And so that's
Totally.
sometimes what my families need, is they need somebody that can actually say, yes, you can do that, where the case manager is not high enough up on that food chain to do that.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, some of what you were saying early on about your sort of inquiry process while you're sitting around a table, and you're coming from this place of curiosity and wanting to better understand so that we can troubleshoot together as a team, and how that can be perceived as potentially an interrogation, or that you're playing the game of gotcha, which you're not, is reminding me of the conversation we had with Colleen
Mm-hmm,
on
mm-hmm,
Unfiltered IEPs, where she was sharing an example of a collegial relationship where she was kind of newer to the team and there were folks that had been around for a longer period of time. And she was further along on her sort of neurodiversity affirming journey with, right? And so, how do you
mm-hmm,
navigate some of those collegial relationships? And one of the things, you lifted up, and I did as well, was this kind of inquiry based process. But one of the things that I also shared, and I think is important here, because I think there's a barrier within the IEP process for allowing this to happen that's different in a collegial relationship,
mm-hmm.
is in a collegial relationship, you can say to the person who's expressing frustration, how do you need me to show up for you? Are you wanting me to be a thought partner in this process? Because I am getting curious about your situation and I do have questions about your situation and I'm feeling ideas percolating, but I don't want to overwhelm you. So are you in that space of like you're wanting to brainstorm and be curious, or are you just in a moment where you're trying to just let some pressure out of the pressure cooker and you just need somebody to hold some space for you and listen and acknowledge your humanity in the situation? And I think that that can happen easier outside of an IEP process than it can happen around the IEP table. But I'm wondering if there's ways that we could name that a little bit, right? Like we are sort of constricted in this moment. And so I am going to ask questions, but I'm coming from this place of curiosity. I'm not trying to catch you. I'm trying to better understand. I know how hard it is to be in a classroom with all the moving dynamics and moving parts of a classroom and trying to hold it all together. So while I am asking questions, please know I'm not trying to like, I don't have a specific thing I'm seeking in mind. I'm not seeking perfection. I'm not seeking the quote unquote right answer. I'm trying to better understand what's happening for you, what's happening for the learner, what's happening in the room, what accommodations might we be missing, so that we can stay in this, like, I'm here to learn with you. And I feel like that might help a little bit. Um, I realize I just totally went off on a tangent that's not necessarily related to bias, but it flipped a switch in my brain that I
No,
thought was important.
but it is related to bias in the sense, in my opinion, of that, like a lot of times the bias that comes into the room can impact that collaborative relationship.
Totally.
And so when we're like trying to ask questions, and you're correct, because and every advocate is different. So I want to make that abundantly clear. The way that Lisa and I approach advocacy is very much like, how do we input supports? How do we navigate this process? How do we make this a process that is beneficial for everyone in the room? And that,
Right.
I think, comes from her being in the school as an educator, me being in the school as a mental health professional, us having family members and friends that are educators, um, and wanting this collaborative environment, right? So
Right.
that's how our advocacy approach is. And so when we come in there, we are asking questions that a lot of times are not able to be asked, um, in certain scenarios and situations, because of the dysregulation of the adult, right? Because I talked about this on another podcast where I was like, as a parent, when you contact me about my child, I'm dysregulated now. So I don't have my mental health brain on. I don't have my adult brain on a lot of the times. I just immediately go into crisis mode, right? So that's our nervous system is being flooded and overwhelmed. So the bias is coming in there with that perception that it is going to be this negative interaction. And so then everything that's stated as negative or taken as a what they're not doing. And I've had that happen often. And so I think that's where we can see that bias on that larger stage for staff. Um, but kind of, pulling it back to the Black and brown bias that we can see and the disability bias that we can see. I know that a big way that bias shows up at the table is the language about the learner. Um,
Oh gosh.
I have constantly seen where I can see similar um, behaviors, right, in a learner, and a Black and brown learner versus a white learner. And the Black and brown learner is labeled aggressive. The Black and brown learner is labeled defiant. The Black and brown learner is labeled lazy, um, disrespectful. And reason
Non-compliant.
why, oh, go ahead. What'd you say?
I said non-compliant and then I stuck my tongue out and rolled my eyes. For those who cannot see me.
Non-compliant, yes. And the reason, why we have this affirming approach and this neuro affirming approach is because we do get curious and we do ask questions. And one of the biggest things that I'm constantly saying at the IEP table, I say it at my own children's IEP table, to the point where one of their special education teachers now goes, I know. Why don't I like the term disrespectful? It's subjective.
100%.
Compliant is subjective, right?
Yep.
Lazy is subjective. Choosing not to is subjective. Um, And often what I find when I then ask more questions and then tie to the learner's disability, we're really looking at executive functioning and sensory issues that the staff is not trained on, and not trained to recognize. And so they don't even have the ability to use the correct language. And so that's why the bias is entering the room. And I want, like, Lisa, do you see that too?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. And um, I think there's other sort of biases at play as well, right? I think there's adultification that happens with Black and Brown learners, that they're supposed to quote unquote know better. So there's a quicker trigger to this is purposeful or manipulative, whereas there's more leeway or flexibility in allowing white children to be kids.
Mhm.
Like kids can just be kids, right? Like you hear that bias a lot, um, and it's garbage.
Got his whole
Of
life ahead of him. Sorry.
right, right, exactly. But there's like I think that in white communities and affluent communities and privileged communities, you hear a lot of like, boys will be boys,
Mhm.
like everything's fine. So you see this sort of delay in support because
Mhm.
we're quote unquote allowing children to just be children.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I think there's a criminalization
Mhm.
that happens in Black and Brown communities because they're supposed to know better, right?
Mhm.
We don't just allow Black and Brown children to be kids. We don't offer that same kind of grace. So I don't know how conscious it is, but I do think it plays out in classrooms, and I think it plays out in doctors' offices, and I think right, but I think it plays out in the IEP process. It plays out in communities. It plays out everywhere, where there is an expectation
Mhm.
that Black and Brown learners are supposed to function at a higher standard, and if they don't, there's a manipulation, whatever that's happening. But in both cases, the response is incorrect and
Mhm.
it harms the child. We're either
Absolutely.
not, well, in both cases, we're just not supporting appropriately. We're not getting curious about what might be underneath. One of my first years mentoring, um, I was in Oakland, California, a very large district. Um, and there was a behaviorist that had been brought in. There were 4 behaviorists for the entire district of 80 something thousand learners. 4
Mhm.
spread all over the place, right? And so they had changed their process for how teachers could like essentially like alert the powers that be that, hey, I have a young person in my classroom that I think needs more support.
Mhm.
And so my brand new teacher had submitted some paperwork for a young Black boy in her second grade class who was having a really difficult time accessing learning. And I remember the behaviorist showing up, and she'd been an RBT in home, like in homes for 6 years. And here was her first job. Actually, I think she was a BCBA, actually. I'm not giving her the credit where it's due. She was BCBA. She came in, and I just remember trying to engage her in kind of the curiosity conversation, like, why do we think this is happening and what could possibly be going on for this young person? And she
Mhm.
was like, I don't care. It's not my job to know why. It just needs to stop. And I was like, could you say that again? Because I don't think my brain just processed what just came out of your mouth. But what ended up happening was it's too long to get into, but basically they had like a track. And so if teachers said, hey, I have some concerns about XYZ student,
Mhm.
they either could be put through an evaluation for special education to at least in an ideal situation get more curious about what maybe is informing what we're seeing in the classroom and what those barriers are,
Right.
or they were set on this like behavioral path where they could not have an IEP, right? Destiny's making a face like, you've got to be freaking kidding me.
My
And
eyes are wide and I am blown away at the ignorance of
right.
students.
And so then it was all a teacher blame game. So learner not getting the help, teacher absolutely feeling interrogated. I just remember my teacher saying to me, I will never, ever, ever, ever ask for this kind of help for a learner ever again, because he's not getting what he needs. I'm not getting what I need. And we're back at square zero. And now I've almost like put a scarlet letter on him. Right. And now I've like blocked access for him to get help through this other, probably more appropriate avenue.
Mm-hmm.
It was unbelievable. Not to throw Oakland under the bus. And I hope things have changed, because it was like 7 or 8 years ago, but not good.
No, but I mean, but even if things have changed, let's say in that district, to be clear, that happens very often in other districts. And
Yeah.
even my son's situation now was 2021, so it's 4 years ago. That situation, we had asked for all the things. Again, my husband and I are both college educated individuals. We have both been in professional capacities and settings. I'm a mental health professional. He, an officer in the military. And so we've been in leadership roles. And I say that to say that comes with its own set of privilege, right? Of recognizing that you're not going to overtalk us and diminish what we're saying. And so we, from the beginning, were like, and before I really got into the affirming side of things, but still, does he need a behavior plan? I mean, like, does he need a special education evaluation? Does he need an FBA, which is a functional behavior assessment? Like, we were like, are these things needed? Because again, my son was diagnosed his kindergarten year with autism. So he had not previously had a diagnosis. And I thought it was interesting in one of our other episodes, Lisa, you said something, and I had to learn how to have that not be a trigger due to the setting I've set up for my kids. And you said with their support teams, you said one of the things that was a trigger is, oh, they're so smart or they're so bright. And I remember thinking to myself, yes, because early on, and that's why me and Lisa always say it's always about nuance, right? It's always about nuance. You're going to hear us say that probably every episode, because
Probably.
it's very nuanced. And so early on, whenever there was a issue or concern that was considered a behavior issue for my son, it was always that he's so smart, he's very smart. And how that was being used was to say either that he was manipulative,
right,
and he was manipulating the situation and he knew how to do different and he knew how to do better, or we know that he can do better and that he's choosing not to.
Right. I'm air quoting the choosing.
With air quotes. And so now that we have built this setting, and when they use that language for his IEP teams, now they're literally referring to like, he is so smart and he is so bright, in the sense of he's doing so well academically, and not as this statement of him trying to manipulate something. But right. I had to literally adjust my mindset. And so as soon as I enter as an advocate into the IEP table space, and the parent has contacted me because they're like, there's a behavior plan issue, they feel like it needs to be updated, there's concerns there, whatever. And I start hearing they're so smart, they're so bright, I'm very quick to kind of, it's like a dog whistle. And I'm very quick. My everything goes up. I am now super honed in on where your next statement is going, because again, it's nuanced. Sometimes it's because literally they're saying this learner is very smart and bright.
Right. Sure.
And then other times it's because there's an added layer of but when, or when they don't, or but they choose. And then that's when I really have to get in and educate about disability.
Yeah. And I actually think there's another scenario where this plays out, and I see this a lot with high masking females, is you'll hear the she's so smart, she could teach my class, I wish I had a classroom full of them. And it's a way, we're weaponizing that as a way to deny access to accommodations or support or services, because they're so smart, so everything else is fine. right? We don't have to pay attention to executive function. We don't have to pay attention to anxiety. We don't have to pay attention to access to communication. We don't have to pay attention to their lived internal experience of being, having that freeze response and totally dissociating and losing learning opportunities because they're so dysregulated and stressed because they're smart.
Right.
So they'll get it. Right. So you see that, like, for me, it's a trigger because I heard that all the time. Oh, she's just so cute. And I'm thinking, what does that have anything to do with anything? Right? Like, gives a crap. But I do think that bias it just shows up. And I'm so glad you named that and that it is really nuanced. And I do think it's so important to hear or to recognize and really attune to the context with which some of those statements are made. They chose to drives me bananas. And I'm
What
like, did
drives me
they?
crazy is when they want to.
Oh God. Right. You don't understand fluctuating capacity. Like, tell me you don't understand fluctuating capacity without telling me you don't understand fluctuating capacity.
That part.
That part.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, that makes me bonkers. And I don't remember which conversation, if it's on record, off record.
We talk all the time, every
We talk
day.
all the time. I can't track if this is or made it to a recording. But one of my biggest pet peeves is when the adults state the emotional experience of the learner. They loved da 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 da. They were so happy at school. And I'm like, how the hell do you know? Have you ever heard of masking?
Yeah.
Like, the answer,
Well, no, but what you
not
talk
long enough
about
to like actually
too,
learn.
right? What you talk about too, though, is like when we do have those high masking learners, and another way that bias shows up is this perception. I've seen it two ways. And I'm constantly having to debunk this, I guess. Um, is that what's seen at school is seen at home. And I'm constantly having to say that is not true because my children at home, when they come home between a bath and bed and all of that stuff, eating dinner, they pretty much just have free reign in the house. Like they can go up and down the stairs, in and out of the room, they can lay on the floor, like they can do all those things.
Sure.
And we're not going, you can't do that, or you only have this much time to eat, or you only have, all the school constrictions. They don't have
Right.
that. And so we're not going to see the same thing at home that you see at school. That's one. The other side of it that I'll see is that if there are no quote unquote issues or concerns at school, because they are high masking, but they are completely melting and dissolving and breaking down once they leave the school building, the school's perception of this not being their problem. And it's like, that is just not true, because eventually when it becomes your problem, you're going to be being reactive and we're trying to be proactive.
That is
And so
correct.
the bias then is that in that situation, the bias is that is a parent issue. Either it's the
Mm-hmm.
parent's issue that they don't see how the learner is responding in school, or it's the parent's issue that they don't see how they are not doing something at home to support the learner. But it's still this bias of that. And a lot of times, if you have parents that work, parents that struggle to fit in IEP meetings, parents that miss IEP meetings. We have parents that miss IEP meetings because schools are just like, this is the date and time. And before
Right.
anyone listening to this podcast that is a school personnel says, we always give an option and a choice. No, the fuck you don't. I'm an advocate, and I've had to tell parents, you tell them you can't do that, and they need to find another date and time, because the school
100%.
has decided this is when we're going to do it, and we don't care when you can do it. So I'm going to jump off that tangent. But that's a way that bias can show up, though.
I'm like, I'm going to jump right back on that tangent. We only do IEPs on Tuesdays. No, you don't. Right. I mean, I want to work together, obviously, but yeah, no, there's parental schedule needs to be taken into consideration absolutely when scheduling an IEP meeting. Just an aside. And of course I had a thought, and of course it disappeared, and it'll come back to me, Destiny. It's gonna come back probably at 2 o'clock this morning, but it's
So, so I think, again, this episode was about when bias shows up at the IEP table and some of the ways that we've pointed out that bias. Oh, wait. Lisa's thought came back. Go ahead, Lisa. Go
it
ahead,
came
Lisa.
back. Well, one of the things that we talked about we recorded a different day, the other episode, so we've had a gap in time. But one of the things that we talked about before that I do want to talk about here, because I do think this is where bias shows up, is eligibility category.
Yes. We were supposed to talk about that.
We were supposed to talk about that.
Yes.
So one of the things that both Destiny and I talked about where bias shows up is the emotional disturbance category and how it's really problematic. I also want to talk about ID, intellectual disability, and the
Yes.
biases that show up there. Because those two categories, um, while, in certain circumstances, rare circumstances, maybe are the appropriate category, um, they both set learners down paths that can be really harmful and problematic. So do you want to start us on the ED category? Because I know that is something that you have a lot of strong feelings. I share your strong feelings, but I want to pass you the mic.
Yeah. So when we talk about ED, or some states it's EBD, because
Yeah,
again, Lisa and I are both physically in different states, California and Georgia. We support families all over, but the states are able to kind of name those categories in whichever way. So it's emotional disturbance or emotional behavior disturbance or emotional behavioral disturbance, either way. A lot of times when you look at the criteria for those categories in order to qualify, there are obviously boxes that have to be checked that are really geared towards, they tend to be geared more towards mood in the classroom. So when different evaluation tools are given to the teacher and the parent, and then there are a lot of times geared towards behavior. So if there's a lot of aggression or defiance, quote unquote, essentially not being responsive to adult demands, typically we're going to steer the learner. Where we can see that bias is that a lot of Black and Brown learners who are actually autistic or ADHD will get put in that category. So we have to go back to private diagnosis a lot of times. So schools don't diagnose. Remember, they determine eligibility based on a category. And oftentimes, Black and Brown learners are on wait lists or in positions where they're just not able to get a formal, private, outside diagnosis. And
sure.
so, when things start arising in a school setting, that's often the first time that they are evaluated for anything. And what I've seen is, even if they do have a private diagnosis, right? The private diagnosis doesn't determine their category of eligibility. So the school will then look at, oh, they may qualify for other health impairment, which is where autistic and ADHD learners can also fall under, or the autism category or the ED category. And we tend to see historically, research wise, statistically, that more Black and Brown learners are put under that ED category. And that's similar to the story that Lisa had earlier, but kind of in between of that, where she mentioned about the behavior path for the path. They do the special education evaluation, but they still believe it is a behavior issue. And so Black and Brown learners are then placed in that category. What we then see is that as they go up, right? Because every 3 years you have this reevaluation. Sometimes that's not done because parents can agree to not have it done. But also, parents don't understand the category, they don't understand the labeling. They're looking at the services. And this is when I found that schools also love to say the category doesn't drive the services. And like in theoretical law land, that is how it's supposed to go. In real life, that's often bullshit. And so then when their teacher gets this IEP, they're like, oh, this kid's a behavior issue. They're a behavior concern. They
Right.
don't know how to control their emotions. That's typically what that gets labeled as. And again, whereas Black and Brown learners are labeled under that category, their white learners might be labeled under autism or ADHD. So whenever I have a Black and Brown learner where they are looking at, and I'm talking about a Black and Brown learner who has been diagnosed with anxiety and ADHD, and they are qualifying for the EBD category. Whenever I see that come up, I immediately go on my spiel of Black and Brown learners, the bias that it causes, and I immediately say no. So while they did not identify that as a category for my son, which I'm surprised, they have twice during his educational career wanted to place him in a specific special education classroom for learners under that category. And both times I made it very clear that my son will never have that as a category of eligibility, and he will never be placed in a classroom that is labeled as ED or EBD.
Yeah. No, when we were having all of our fun trying to get our daughter found eligible back in the day, I'll spare the details. They're all in Erin's book. Of the initial process. So we initially just tried to go through speech and then So she has this speech assessment. She was 4 years old at the time, so I was in the room for it. The gal like did it wrong every which way to heaven and then some. And I even called her on it during it. Not that I'm a speech language pathologist, but as a classroom teacher, I knew how standardized assessments were supposed to go, and she wasn't following any of that. And so I was like, I don't think you're supposed to be, giving her the answers or touching her or, doing the things you're doing. Anyway, when we went to leave, this person told me she doesn't have a speech problem. She has an emotional problem. And she needs to like see our psychologist. And at the time I was incredibly naive, and I was in like a little dessert group with parents of other neurodivergent learners. And they were all my son's age. So they were all like 3 years ahead. So I thought the psychologist was like, sidestep her and we'll be fine, not realizing this is like a systemic issue.
Right.
And so I was like, there's like no way I'm letting my kid anywhere near that person. But my husband, being the man that he is, I'm not one to like take to bed, but I was so distraught after that initial eval. It was on a Friday that I pretty much got in bed and did not get out until Monday. And I am never like that, but it was like literally the thing I was the most worried about kind of coming true. So my husband contacted the speech path, and her response to him was, "What do you care if it's ED? It's services." And his response to her, because he is who he is, was, that is like saying somebody who is a type 1 diabetic has type 2 diabetes. Not only will it take you down the wrong treatment path, so to speak, it's stigmatizing. And she was like, yeah, I don't get it. It's services. I don't understand your problem. And he was like, thank you very kindly. And then if you're so interested, you can read the book and find out what Sir Aaron did to deal with this fine person. But yeah, I mean, I find at an IEP table that yes, Black and Brown learners are absolutely at disproportionate rates considered aggressive, manipulative, all those things that would be then put under like the ED category or EBD category. I also find that higher masking females who are anxious, even if they have an autism diagnosis, also get that same eligibility category with the same garbage conversation that my husband had with speech path many moons ago of what do you care at services, without any real understanding of what bias comes along with that eligibility category. And yes, the folks that say that eligibility category doesn't drive services, that is 100% correct. It does not. And yet in practice, it does.
Right. There's a difference between what is in black and white and what actually happens.
150%. The other eligibility category I wanted to lift up is ID, because I see this over checked for our non and minimally speaking learners, where we are absolutely conflating ability to speak with ability to think. And so because the standardized testing is deeply biased and flawed from here to hell and gone, right? Like it's horrid. It's not a way to accurately capture what non-speakers, unreliable speakers, minimal speakers know. And so those scores for like quote unquote ability testing, IQ testing, are often quite low. And those learners get labeled as ID, and then they get put in segregated classrooms with modified curriculum. And then we have determined when a young person is literally 3 to 5 years old that they will not be graduating with a full diploma. And whenever I say this in a meeting, oh, we clutch pearls. We're not determining outcome. And I'm like,
to say out loud.
Well, I'm gonna, because you're hurting this kid. I'm trying so hard not to cuss right now, Dustin.
I'm so proud of you. No, but minimally speaking and unreliably speaking learners, as well as ELL learners.
Oh, 100%.
And that inaccurate testing, even think about, and I always say this, my son and I are very, very verbal speaking as autistics. When dysregulated in new situations, uncomfortable situations, not very verbal. And so imagine a autistic learner being evaluated and not knowing this individual and shutting down and not being responsive to the questions. And then there's a presumption that they don't understand when really it's just that I'm not comfortable. Tiffany Joseph, non functioning autism, I love how she always talks about, she's who I think of when I think of assessing for alternate mastery, for learners that are non-speaking, and that she gave this amazing example that she gives all the time where as a para she came in the room and she put letters on the board and had said A and had the learner point to A, and that's all it took for them to realize this learner knew their entire alphabet, knew how to spell their name, knew how to spell words, but nobody had thought to do that. And I was like, that's because her having experienced it and lived it as a Black autistic AAC user with children who are AAC users was able to presume competence. And it shouldn't take that, but it did.
Right. Right. Yeah. TJ has another story from maybe a year or two ago. I mean, what is time? I can't remember when it was a while ago, where same thing. They were working as a para in a self-contained classroom, non-speaking, I believe third grader. And the teachers and other staff members were a little bit of flutter, like, how do we know if they can read or not read? How do we assess, and they spelled things out, like wrote things out, like, I can't remember the examples, but like literally 100%, like the kid was able to point to the right word of like, I think the example, the first one was, is a mushroom an example of a fungi, or I don't know, a car, or so, I can't remember what the other thing was. And they pointed to fungi, and then they did like a few other things, and the learner was able to point to the right word every single time. And so TJ was able to go back to the staff, like, not only is this learner like reading like at grade level, they're actually beyond grade level, right? And so I just I'm really wanting to be cognizant of the difference between presuming competence and presuming knowledge, right? It's not that every single learner is ready for the pacing and the content that their non-disabled peers are ready for. I'm not saying that. But I think that when we presume that even intellectually disabled learners are able to think, are able to experience, are able to understand, right? Just because you're trapped in a body that's not cooperating with you does not mean that you should only be exposed to matching colors and like whatever happens with these modified curriculums, the same crap year after year after year after year. It's
Exactly.
friggin' insulting.
Mm-hmm.
So it to me, I think that category, same thing with ED, are overused.
Correct.
We don't have the data. I'm
Mm.
like, but your measuring tool to collect that data is for trash.
Oh, we're gonna do a
Your
whole episode
data is
because they don't
trash.
the discussion of what data is and what data isn't um annoys me to pieces.
Yeah, that'll be a different episode.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, we can wrap this episode up. I just because I think we're probably close to the hour
Yeah.
mark. Destiny, full transparency over here. Destiny is the one recording, so she's got a timer and all the things, and I'm just here with my hair on fire. It should shock everyone. But I wanted to definitely name how bias shows up in eligibility categories because I think that it absolutely does and needs to be named out loud so that we can try to change things a little bit here.
No, and that's what really spawned the thought process of this episode too. It's just, we see so much bias that we're like, there's so many ways and layers to it. So, like, just to just kind of recap, bias can show up in eligibility category. Bias can show up in the language used at the table. Bias can show up in just that negative perception of questions being asked and trying to gain insight. Bias can show up in the support sought for a learner. That's really what Lisa's, example of when she was a mentor was getting to, is that, while this teacher was very much trying to support this learner, the individuals that had to help her do that were already shaping the narrative of what type of support this learner needed. And that was in bias. I mean, it's based out of bias. Um, Bias can determine how you interact with a parent to even determine support, right? So, like, do you mention to them about evaluations or speaking with a professional in the school, like the school counselor or the psychologist, or do you mention, you know, that wanting to have a meeting, or do you bring up, you know, I feel like they might be struggling with executive functioning or sensory, or do you simply frame it as they're not listening, they're disrespectful, they're this and this, and that needs to be fixed. How you really approach the parent about the learner can be based out of bias. And one of the biggest ways to combat that is to learn to be mindful, to listen, to engage, to approach from a support standpoint. And another thing that I think is so important is I always say, when the words you're using, would you want someone to describe your child that way? And when you're talking about another adult, would you want someone to talk about you that way? And if the answer is no, then you really need to go back to the drawing board.
Absolutely. Couldn't have said it better myself. We will see
So,
you next time on this because you're triggering things in my brain too, where I think, and we're going to talk about this on a future episode, of some of that bias plays into how we engage families to even
right,
begin the process, not just how we're describing the learner, but how we're inviting parents to the table and how we're treating them in that process.
absolutely. And this and every episode we will dive into in different areas and aspects, I'm sure, as we go through this podcast. So this is really just like a brief thing on where we see bias, but you'll hear us talk about examples and things in other episodes. In our next episode, we are going to talk about documentation. We're going to talk about the importance of documentation. We're probably going to talk about how documentation can be biased.
Probably.
And we're going to
It's
talk about,
fair.
how documentation can really guide services and supports throughout your learner's IEP. Thank you again for joining us here in the Affirming Village. We're your co-hosts, Dr. Destiny Huff and Lisa Baskin Wright, and we hope today's conversation leaves you feeling seen, supported, and better equipped to advocate for yourself or your learner. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share this with someone else in the village. Until next time, keep advocating, keep affirming, and keep building the village we all deserve.